Welcome to this explainer. Picture this. You're standing in the center of a bustling foreign marketplace. The sights, the scents, and the symphonies of an unfamiliar language are swirling around you in this dizzying cascade. Suddenly, a total stranger locks eyes with you and offers a warm, unmistakable smile. Instantly, you feel this profound sense of shared humanity that just cuts right through the foreign fog. But it begs a massive question. Are human emotions actually experienced and expressed exactly the same way everywhere around the world? Today, we are going to dismantle that assumption entirely and look at how culture serves as the invisible heartbeat of literally all human interaction.
Here is our roadmap for today. Section 1, the hook. 2, the great emotion debate. 3, bridging the cultural divide. 4, how we want to feel. 5, the danger of misunderstanding. And finally, 6, the future of emotion. Let's get right into it.
Section 1, the hook. Biological baseline. First things first, to figure out how culture shapes our feelings, we have to establish where those feelings actually come from.
So think about this. Do you actually need to be human to have emotions? Are our inner emotional fires just hardwired evolutionary gifts, or are they scripts written entirely by the society we happen to live in?
Take Coco the gorilla, for instance, and her kitten. A really fascinating look in the Journal of Comparative Psychology dug into the deep evolutionary roots of our emotional behavior. It turns out that primary emotional expressions, things like smiling, fear, and anger, pop up universally across primate lineages. They're basically crucial communication tools from the time we're infants all the way through adulthood. So yes, absolutely, our initial emotional reactions are deeply anchored in shared biology. But, and here is the real kicker, as humans grow up, social learning takes the wheel. Society steps in and radically modifies how we manage and express those biological signals.
Which brings us to Section 2, the great emotion debate, the historical standoff. Because once upon a time, the scientific community was completely split on how this biological baseline actually interacted with society. Imagine the two boxing corners of early psychology. In one corner, you had the universalists. They argued that emotional states are purely instinctual, just identical biological survival mechanisms hardwired into our nervous system by our ancient ancestors. To them, basic emotions work identically across all geographic boundaries. End of story. But in the opposite corner, you had the social constructivists. They argued that human groups adapted in totally unique ways to their distinct environments, making emotions highly variable cultural creations. They believed cultural practices are so deeply baked into us that we're basically blind to how our societies are crafting our automatic feelings.
So, moving to Section 3, bridging the cultural divide, finding the middle ground. How on earth did the scientific community bridge that massive philosophical gap? Well, it took some serious, boots-on-the-ground empirical research. In the 1970s, researchers like Paul Ekman and Wallace Friesen completely revolutionized the field. They introduced the facial action coding system, which essentially cataloged specific facial muscle configurations. They traveled the globe, showing participants from vastly different societies photos of facial expressions just to see if they could match them to translated emotion words. And as Ekman noted, emotions aren't just localized in some separate part of the brain, they're a product of the whole brain and deeply intertwined with our cultural realities.
The empirical data from these global studies revealed a really fascinating duality. On one hand, yes, basic emotional expressions were recognized globally at levels far greater than chance. But consider the variance here. 95% of American participants anchored a smile to happiness, compared to merely 69% of Sumatran participants. That is a massive difference in how a completely fundamental biological expression is interpreted.
What this striking variance exposed is something psychologists call cultural display rules. And this is a hugely important concept. It means we might all universally feel basic emotions on the inside. Your heart rate is going to jump identically whether you live in New York or Jakarta, but we are culturally trained on when, where, and exactly how it's appropriate to show those feelings on the outside. So contemporary research stopped asking if emotions were entirely universal or entirely constructed and just started mapping out the precise interplay of both.
Let's look at Section 4, how we want to feel, modern psychology, and the ideal affect. You see, culture doesn't just dictate how we show emotion. Incredibly, it actually shapes how we desire to feel.
Psychology researcher Hazel Marcus hit the nail on the head when she said culture is not some exotic accessory to the human mind. It is the very medium through which our minds develop their entire emotional architecture. It's the foundation of the whole shebang.
A critical piece of this puzzle is the difference between how societies model the concept of the self. In Western North American contexts, we typically see an independent model of the self. People view themselves as distinct, stable entities focused heavily on personal expression, saying things like, "I am friendly," or "I am cheerful." Conversely, East Asian contexts foster an interdependent model, where being a person means being fundamentally connected to your community. "I am a daughter," or "I am a worker." Independent selves tend to use high arousal emotions to influence others, while interdependent selves utilize emotional control to blend smoothly into their social environments and maintain harmony.
And these models of the self dictate our ideal affect, the emotional states we actively chase after. North Americans typically hunt for high arousal, positive states. We want excitement, enthusiasm. We want to go skydiving. East Asians, however, tend to prioritize low arousal positive states like calm, peacefulness, and the serene tranquility of something like Tai Chi. A fascinating 2015 study by Brett Ford actually showed that actively pursuing happiness predicted lower well-being for participants in the United States because they pursued it through individualistic, high arousal achievements. But that exact same pursuit predicted higher well-being in East Asia, where it was channeled through socially engaged, harmonious pathways.
Which brings us to Section 5, the danger of misunderstanding real-world clinical stakes. Grasping these cultural differences is way more than just academic theory. It literally has life or death stakes in the real world of clinical diagnosis and workplace dynamics.
Take the psychological concept of expressive suppression. It's exactly what it sounds like, consciously hiding your outward emotional responses to whatever is happening around you. This behavior is often severely, sometimes dangerously, misunderstood by Western clinical practitioners.
Let's compare how this plays out. In Western contexts, hiding your emotions is heavily correlated with severe depression and low life satisfaction. If you're constantly bottling things up, a Western therapist is going to see a massive red flag. But for a student from a collectivist family, suppressing their own anxiety just to avoid burdening their parents is actually a required, healthy, adaptive social tool. It carries absolutely zero negative consequences for their psychological health. In fact, clinical depression manifests differently altogether. Depressed Westerners show muted emotional reactivity, whereas depressed East Asians often exhibit normal or even highly increased emotional expressiveness.
I absolutely love this quote by Arthur Kleiman. He notes that if clinicians or employers view behavior through a rigid, ethnocentric lens, they walk through a world of mirrors, mistakenly expecting everyone to reflect their own inner image. A 2021 clinical study on cultural ruptures showed that when therapists miss these cues, ethnic minority individuals experience intense feelings of being misunderstood, which often leads them to just quit therapy altogether. And in the workplace, a reserved, calm East Asian employee might get passed over for a leadership role simply because their quiet politeness is falsely evaluated as a lack of enthusiasm by Western standards. It's a devastating misinterpretation.
Finally, let's look at Section 6, the future of emotion, evolving research frontiers. We've mapped out a lot, but there is still so much more to explore.
Future research absolutely has to move beyond the traditional North American and East Asian binary. We need to investigate how bicultural immigrants balance constantly conflicting emotional scripts. We also need to explore how things like children's storybooks actually transmit cultural ideals and socialize emotional expectations right before bed. And finally, we've got to map out how our biological temperaments interact with rapidly changing systemic environments, like economic instability.
As affect valuation theory pioneer Jean Tsai beautifully puts it, our ultimate goal here isn't to force everyone into one neat little box. We're striving to discover the universal grammar of human emotion, that shared biological heartbeat, while celebrating the endless, beautiful cultural dialects in which it's spoken. By mastering this, we stop being rigid technicians and we become deeply empathetic architects of human understanding.
So, I want to leave you with this final thought to reflect on your own upbringing. If you were raised in a home with one set of cultural values, but you work or study in an environment heavily influenced by another, how do you handle the emotional whiplash of switching between those two different worlds? How do you navigate the emotional expectations placed upon you in our beautifully interconnected world? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep reflecting, and I'll see you next time.